Daniel Leighton Shaver was born on December 29th, 1989. He lived in Granbury, Texas, where he had married his teenage sweetheart, a woman named Lainey Sweet. The two would be married for the better part of a decade, during which time they brought two daughters into the world, Natalie and Emery. Daniel worked as a pest control worker who often traveled out of state, primarily to the southwestern states, New Mexico and Arizona, the latter of which his family was hoping to move to in the near future. This work is what brought Daniel out to Mesa, Arizona in January of 2016. He was working for his father-in-law's company and was temporarily staying at a La Quinta Inn and Suites, just off of US Route 60. In this hotel, in particular, in the hallway outside of his room, on the 5th floor, his life would be tragically cut short. This is the story of Daniel Shaver. Welcome to Unresolved. I am your host, Micheal Whelan. This episode is going to be unlike most of the stories I cover. It's going to feature a modern case that tackles some current social issues, which I believe need addressing. Unlike the stories I usually cover, we know almost everything about this story. What happened, who was involved, when, etc. But I believe that we have not heard the end of it. You'll understand what I mean as the story unfolds, and why I consider this an unresolved story. However, before we get into that, I'd like to briefly tell you how you can help support the show. If you would like to support Unresolved, please consider heading to patreon.com/unresolvedpod to get access to commercial-free episodes, bonus episodes, and more. Once again, that's patreon.com/unresolvedpod. You can also support the show by buying some podcast merch. Just head to our website, unresolved.me, and click on the store icon at the top of the page. To learn more, just listen through to the close of this episode, or visit the aforementioned website, unresolved.me. Now, without any further ado, let's learn more about the final day of Daniel Shaver. On the evening of January 18th, 2016, Daniel Shaver was spending his time indoors. He had ordered a pizza to his hotel room just after sunset, and that night he ended up encountering two other people that were staying in the hotel. A man and woman named Luis Nunez and Monique Portillo. Both were staying in separate rooms at the La Quinta Inn and Suites, and had been brought to the region for a Dollar General training conference. After encountering these two and seeming to make friends, Daniel invited the two back to his hotel room for some shots. They were kind enough to oblige, and followed the affable Daniel back to his room on the 5th floor of the hotel. There, they began taking shots of Bacardi, and Daniel took this opportunity to show them his guns. Rather, his pellet guns. You see, Daniel worked for a pest removal company, and he used these small caliber air rifles to exterminate birds inside grocery stores. They shot pellets. However, both Luis Nunez and Monique Portillo, Daniel's two guests, agreed that at least one of his guns looked like a military rifle at first glance. At one point, Daniel asked Luis if he wanted to shoot the rifle, and seemed to take aim out of a nearby window. Luis told him no, specifically telling him that it was a stupid idea, and he seemed to grow concerned about the environment in the room. He would leave just a short time later, but not before Monique cautioned the two men. According to her later statement, she told both of them, quote, "Don't be so close to the window. People may get the wrong idea." Unbeknownst to the trio inside the room, a couple down in the hotel's hot tub had already gotten the wrong idea. Within minutes, these two had informed the front desk that someone seemed to be pointing a rifle at the nearby highway. This prompted a phone call to 911 from the hotel staff that were working that evening.
911 emergency.
Hi, I'm with the La Quinta at 6530 East Superstition Springs Boulevard. And a couple of the guests have come to me. I'm an employee here. They come to me and they told me that somebody's pointing a rifle outside of one of the windows in our building.
Okay, and this is 6530 East Superstition Springs Boulevard in Mesa?
Yes, it is.
Do we know what he's pointing it at? Do we know what he's pointing the gun at?
We're not sure. They're saying 4th floor.
Okay, one moment here.
That blue one right there? That's,
yeah, that's what I thought.
5th floor. That's going to be...
That's 502.
502? Alright, yeah, I have the room number.
Okay, is anybody injured at this time?
Nobody's injured at the moment, no. We've got some scared people, but...
Okay. What room number?
We believe 502, but... Yeah, that's the room that he's staying in.
Okay, have you seen the person that's staying in that room? Have you seen the person that's staying in that room?
Yeah, I'm going to double check the map right now to make sure that that's absolutely the room that we're thinking about. But I can get you their name right now.
Okay, and what is their name?
Hey, where's the map? Where's the map of the... You keep showing it to people to show them where to park. Yeah.
Okay, so what is his name?
I have to double check and make sure, because, you know. Yeah. That's definitely 502. Okay, his name... Let me sign in to my computer right now. Yeah, Daniel Shaver. His name's spelled like it sounds.
S-H-A-V-E-R?
Yeah.
Do we have a date of birth for him?
No.
Leticia Jimenez, a front desk employee of the La Quinta Inn and Suites that Daniel Shaver was staying at, responded to some allegations of a gun being pointed out of a window. Leticia followed the concerned guest outside and identified the room as Daniel Shaver's. She knew this because he had ordered and received a pizza delivery earlier that night, so it was easy to pinpoint the room as being his. Leticia would go upstairs to the 5th floor to ensure that everything was okay, paying a visit to Daniel's room where, she later recalled, the door was open and 2 men were inside holding a gun. She would later state that it might have looked like they were in the middle of a gun deal, but we know that was not the case. It was a short time after this that Luis Nunez, one of Daniel's 2 guests, decided to leave. He was staying in the same hotel, but decided to go for a drive. Perhaps one of the better decisions he could have made that night. Monique Portillo, the other guest, decided to hang around for a few minutes, but was preparing to call it a night herself. She was gearing up to go back to her room when the phone in Daniel's room rang, and he answered. On the other end of the line was a police officer who informed Daniel, and anyone inside, to leave the room slowly. As the 2 did so, they were surprised to see 6 heavily armed police officers standing just down the hallway, at least 2 of which were pointing AR-15 rifles in their direction. Over the next several minutes, Daniel and Monique were warned that any failure to comply with the officers' demands would result in them being shot and/or killed.
Stop right there! Stop! Stop! Get on the ground, both of you! Lay down on the ground! Lay down on the ground! Who else is in the room?
Nobody.
Nobody else is in the room?
Nobody.
Are you positive?
Nobody. Absolutely positive.
Okay. Since apparently we have a failure for you to comprehend simple instructions, I'm going to go over some of them again, okay? Can you both hear and understand me?
Yes.
All right. If you make a mistake, another mistake, there's a very severe possibility you're both going to get shot. Do you understand that?
Yes.
I do.
Yes.
All right.
What the?
This is, shut up. I'm not here to be tactful or diplomatic with you. You listen, you obey. For one thing, did I tell you to move, young man? Did I tell you to
No, sir. No,
put
sir.
both
No,
your
sir.
hands,
No, sir. No, sir.
put both your hands on the top of your head and interlace your fingers. Take your feet and cross your left foot over your right foot. Who else is in the room?
Nobody.
Daniel Shaver and Monique Portillo were crouched down towards the end of the hallway, near the entrance to Daniel's hotel room. The police officers responding to this call seemed reticent to approach because they did not want to expose themselves to the hotel room door. After all, if there was someone else inside, they might be armed. The fear of these police officers was understandable, but their following actions were much less so. Police officers began barking instructions at the two hotel guests, sometimes shouting over one another, and Monique was the first to be escorted away from the scene.
Young man, you're not to move. You're to put your eyes down and look down at the carpet. You're to keep your fingers interlaced behind your head. You're to keep your feet crossed. If you move, we're going to consider that a threat, and we are going to deal with it, and you may not survive it. Do you understand me?
Yes, sir.
Young lady, shut up and listen. All right? You are to keep your feet crossed. Take both of your hands, put them flat in front of you. You are to push yourself up to a kneeling position. Kneeling position. Now, put both your hands in the air. Okay, crawl towards us.
I'm so sorry.
Sergeant Charles Langley, one of the commanding officers at the scene, ordered Daniel to cross his legs while he was laying prone on the floor. He then ordered Daniel to pull himself up to a kneeling position with his legs crossed. As you can imagine, this motion resulted in Daniel's legs becoming uncrossed, and Sergeant Langley warned him that failure to comply would result in his death.
Okay, young man, listen to my instructions and do not make a mistake. You are to keep your legs crossed. Do you understand me?
Yes, sir.
You are to put both of your hands palm down, straight out in front of you. Push yourself up to a kneeling position. I said keep your legs crossed!
I'm sorry.
I didn't say this in conversation. Hands in the air! Hands up in the air! You do that again, we're shooting you. Do you understand?
Please do not shoot me.
Then listen to my instructions.
I'm trying to just do what you
Don't talk! Listen!
During this whole encounter, it is unknown what was stopping the officers involved from simply stepping forward and handcuffing Daniel Shaver. Several law enforcement officials have critiqued the way in which they handled this encounter, but more on that later. Sergeant Charles Langley and his fellow officers continued to demand Daniel Shaver crawl towards them, all the while giving him conflicting demands. Hands in the air, legs crossed, crawl towards us, etc. Daniel, who is clearly intoxicated, struggles to make sense of all of these demands. He continues pleading with officers not to shoot him, but as he tries to comply with their demands, it becomes evident that he is not physically capable of doing so. It is also worth noting that during this encounter, Daniel is wearing loose-fitting basketball shorts, the kind that slide off very easily. While Daniel is crawling down this hotel hallway, his shorts continue to slide off, and as he is crawling on his hands and knees, he makes a move backwards to pull up his shorts. Just a warning, the following audio is very disturbing.
Hands straight up in the air. Do not put your hands down for any reason. You think you're going to fall, you better fall on your face. Your hands go back in the small of your back or down. We are going to shoot you. Do you understand me?
Yes, sir.
Crawl towards me. Crawl towards me!
Yes, sir.
Don't go! Get up on him. Okay, hold on him. One with me. Key card. Key card. Go. I got here. Sam 81998. Hold on. They gave me 2 key cards. Stay quiet. You got him in the door. Yeah. Pull her and get her out of here. Get up. Okay, hold on it. Okay, I need one up with me. One up with me. Come on, you guys. Get up with me. Take his place, holding the door. Okay. Okay, secure your weapon. Secure your weapon.
Secured.
Okay, go. You're up.
Officer Philip Brailsford, one of the officers armed with a semi-automatic AR-15 at the end of the hallway, opened fire on Daniel Shaver. Within a little more than a second, he has shot Daniel 5 times in total, including shots to his face, the back of his head, his back, his chest, and his knee. He would be the only officer out of 6 to open fire. Daniel was killed instantly. No paramedics would be called to the scene. Officers stated that Daniel was reaching towards his waist, but it was determined that he had no weapons on his person. In fact, the only 2 weapons he had, inside his hotel room, dozens of feet away, were nothing more than pellet guns. Daniel Shaver's last word before being shot was please. Following the shooting of Daniel Shaver, the investigation into his death proceeded normally, at least as normally as you'd expect for a police-related shooting. The only other guest that was present at the time, Monique Portillo, was escorted outside, where a female officer questioned her briefly. These videos are not very informative, but I'll make them available on the podcast website if you wish to watch them. When the police reports were filed, it was revealed that Daniel had reached for his waistband during a quote-unquote confrontation with police. This made it an open and shut case in so many words. More often than not, someone reaching for their waistband poses a lethal threat to officers, though it is okay for them to respond in kind, even when it is later found that there is no weapon involved, and the officers may have been overreacting to a man whose pants were simply falling down. Back in Texas, meanwhile, Daniel's widow, Lainey Sweet, was informed of his death, and a short time later took her frustrations at becoming a single parent to the internet. During a video, she holds up an urn of Daniel's ashes, informing the rest of the world that that is all that is left of her husband.
Hey guys, I just wanted to make a quick video because I just need to share my frustrations. As you guys know, my husband was killed a few weeks ago while traveling for work in Arizona. And he was a really good dad. He was a hard worker and my best friend. It's really hard and frustrating because his story isn't being shared that much. It is by my friends, so I don't want you guys to think that I don't appreciate that. I do. But it's frustrating because he was white and because he was just a young guy and he doesn't have, disabilities or, all these things that other stories are being shared, that it doesn't matter because his life didn't matter too. He was my husband and my kid's father, and it definitely matters to us. And now all that's left of him is this. And I appreciate those who are helping get his story out, because what happened was wrong. And I hope one day justice will come, and the Mesa Police Department will give me answers for why they killed him. So please continue to help share our story and get things out. I'm sorry I'm emotional. I'm also 6 months pregnant. And this is just a horrible thing to go through. So please continue to share. I beg you from my heart, please. Just help get his story out. Thank you.
Detective Paul Sipe of the Mesa Police Department led the investigation into the shooting death of Daniel Shaver. Detective Sipe arrived at the crime scene shortly after the shooting had unfolded, and was told by many that a man had been pointing a rifle out of a 5th floor window. Of course, he and the other officers would learn that this was nothing more than a pellet gun, but officers involved told him that they did not know that at the time. They assumed it was a regular rifle, which made them cautious about the encounter overall. Detective Paul Sipe heard from the officers involved that a young officer named Philip Brailsford had been the one to pull the trigger, and had shot Daniel Shaver 5 times, after he had responded uncooperatively, according to the police report, and had reached behind his back, quote, in a threatening manner. However, when Detective Sipe interviewed Monique Portillo, the only other person in that hallway at around the time of the shooting, he realized that the officers involved were not telling him everything. They had omitted what he called vital information from the police reports, which changed the story and the context of the story dramatically. These included details like Daniel Shaver crying and pleading with officers not to shoot him for minutes preceding the actual shooting, as well as the fact that he was visibly drunk, barely able to comprehend the demands being made of him. This initial suspicion led to Detective Paul Sipe choosing to review the body cam footage of the incident, which came from Officer Brailsford, the same man that had pulled the trigger. This changed everything. Detective Sipe took this case to Maricopa County Attorney Bill Montgomery, who made the decision to pursue legal action after reviewing the footage for himself. In Montgomery's words, the shooting was not justified based on what he had seen, and he claimed that Officer Philip Brailsford was, quote, manifesting an extreme indifference to human life, recklessly causing the death of another. We're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from today's sponsors. Philip Brailsford, often referred to as Mitch, which was his middle name, was a 25-year-old officer with the Mesa Police Department. Considered a rising star in the department, Philip came from a legacy of police service. His father had previously worked with the Mesa Police Department. Philip had graduated from Mesa Desert Ridge High School in 2009 with a 3.5 GPA, and then served as an LDS missionary in Ecuador between 2009 and 2011. Following that, he enlisted in the National Guard and enrolled at Mesa Community College. All the while, he was attempting to become an actor. He had several photos and some personal information listed on an acting website, where he attempted to find work in the region to no avail. Brailsford was then hired by the Mesa Police Department shortly thereafter, and quickly became a star there. He often led his squad in both monthly arrests and traffic stops, and had told his superior, on at least one occasion, that he aimed to arrest at least one person a day. His ultimate goal, he said, was to move up to one of the region's gang units. During his 2+ years as an officer, Brailsford maintained his expert marksmanship status, and earned himself a reputation as an officer that got things done. Unfortunately, this sometimes came at a cost. In 2015, Brailsford was investigated for body slamming a teenager during an arrest at a gas station. TMZ was able to recover cell phone footage of this incident, which shows then Officer Brailsford put the teenage suspect into a headlock, spin them around, and then slam them into the ground with his body weight. Afterwards, Brailsford seems to be the one to calm down the teenager and his friends, all the while maintaining a firm hold of the handcuffs the teenager was now bound in, while the kid stands there with a torn t-shirt.
Do I lock the doors? Lock the doors. Lock the doors.
I'm ready. I'm ready. Get on the fucking ground now. Back up.
Yeah, that one too.
Get on the fucking ground. Back up.
Why is he hitting it?
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Get on the fucking ground.
Mom, get over here. Like, these cops are punching James.
Obviously, you got issues.
They're being so aggressive with him. They're punching him. They're throwing him around. And this guy fucking choked me, threw me to the fucking ground. And put me in the fucking feet. And now he's trying to fucking beat me. He's trying to beat me. I'm not. Look, they're kicking him right now. And they're fucking stop!
Oh my god.
Back up.
Stop!
I am suing each and every single one of you.
Stop.
Suing.
Let go of him.
Everyone back up.
Can I
And
talk
tell
to you,
him to
please?
stop punching him.
Can we walk away and talk? I need to talk to you.
Yes.
Alongside 3 other officers at the scene, Brailsford was investigated by Internal Affairs for inappropriate amount of force, but they were all later cleared. That incident would be the only notable check on the police career of Philip Brailsford, at least until the shooting of Daniel Shaver brought him to the forefront of national headlines.
From the ABC 15 Live Desk, brand new details just coming in on that case we brought you at the top of our newscast. A Mesa police officer charged with second-degree murder for a shooting back in January. And this statement just coming in from his family. On behalf of her two young daughters, the victim, Lainey Sweet, wants everyone to know her husband, Daniel Shaver, was a wonderful and devoted husband and father. He was a kind, loving, and peaceful human being. His tragic and senseless murder has caused irreparable devastation to all their lives. Today's announcement of second-degree murder charges against Mesa police officer Brailsford is the first step towards justice for Daniel and his family. We commend Maricopa County Attorney Bill Montgomery for his decision to bring these criminal charges, and we fully expect justice will be served.
At the time of the Daniel Shaver shooting, January of 2016, Philip Brailsford had been working for the Mesa Police Department for approximately 2 years. It was approximately 2 months after the shooting, in March of 2016, that he would be charged with second-degree murder. Instead of being arrested, he was given a summons to appear in court, where he ultimately pleaded not guilty. If found to have acted irrationally or irresponsibly, he would be facing 25 years in prison, as well as additional time for separate charges of reckless manslaughter. Philip Brailsford was the first Maricopa County officer to be criminally charged for an on-duty shooting since 2010. When then-Officer Richard Chrisman was charged, and later convicted, of manslaughter and assault. Later that month, on March 21st, 2016, Brailsford would be fired by the Mesa Police Department, who cited several policy violations in their decision to terminate his employment. Among them, including unsatisfactory performance, was Brailsford engraving the words, "You're fucked," on his rifle dust cover. That phrase, "You're fucked," was engraved on Brailsford's AR-15, which he had used to shoot and kill Daniel Shaver. Unfortunately, that information would not be released to the jury in the upcoming trial. During a bond hearing, Daniel Shaver's widow, Lainey Sweet, begged the judge to consider making Brailsford's release tentative on bail. She pleaded with the judge to consider her husband's life worth some kind of value, and to not give the man who shot and killed him any more leniency after his death.
Hi, yes. On behalf of my daughters and I would like to request that a fair bond be set to validate that my husband's life had value and meaning. That this be treated like all other second-degree murder charges. Having no bond sends the message that my husband's life had zero value. And I would like to say that Daniel Shaver, the value of it not, I'm sorry. Oh, this is overwhelming. The no bond sends a message that Daniel Shaver, his life it had no value. Is that the message that you're going to send today?
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Judge.
Pretrial release conditions often look to people like punishment. If somebody goes to jail, it looks as though the person is being held responsible for his or her crime. Pretrial release conditions are not punishment. They are a way for the court to ensure that somebody is going to be present for his next hearing, and a way for the court to ensure that the community is as safe as possible during that time. The court has considered the requirements of the statute. The court believes that based upon the circumstances in this case, that there is very little risk that the defendant will not be present at his next court date. There is no criminal history and nothing to suggest that the community is not safe if the defendant is not in custody. The court believes that supervised release to pretrial services is the most appropriate form of release in this case, and the court will, in regard to release conditions, place the defendant on supervised release. To pretrial services, the court will order that the defendant not possess any weapons that the defendant not have any contact with victims or next of kin, the defendant not return to the scene of the crime. In regard to the next court date, Mr. Marins, did your client want to waive his time limits for the preliminary hearing?
Yes, Your Honor, we would so waive.
Okay. The court discussed with counsel the setting of a preliminary hearing on May 16 and May 17. Ms. Charbel, does that work for the state?
The trial of Philip Brailsford was originally scheduled to begin in February of 2017, but several hearings were held regarding Brailsford's body camera footage, which would become the most pivotal point of the ensuing trial. Daniel Shaver's widow, Lainey Sweet, and her attorney argued that the body cam footage should be released, if not publicly, then at least to them and the jury. At that point, she had still not seen the footage, which was being kept guarded prior to Brailsford's trial. Her request was initially denied by police, who then only agreed to show her the footage if she agreed not to discuss its contents with anyone, including the press. She agreed, and actually recorded a hidden conversation she had with police regarding this footage. I will not include that conversation on this podcast, due to some legalities and me not wanting to get sued, but you can find it yourself if you are interested. A partial portion of the video was released ahead of the trial, in May of 2016, which showed only brief snippets of Daniel's overall encounter with police officers. It omitted large parts of the incident, as well as footage of the shooting itself. This was a point argued by both the prosecution and the defense, who all wanted to protect Philip Brailsford's right to a fair trial. In the trial itself, the jury would not be able to see all of the footage showing the shooting of Daniel Shaver, much like Brailsford's engraved rifle dust cover, which again read, "You're fucked," of which knowledge was withheld from the trial. The jury would only be given an abridged look at the case.
We have to get to some other local news now for you. The jury is set, and today will be opening statements in the trial for a former Mesa police officer who shot and killed a Texas father.
The trial of Philip Brailsford commenced on October 23, 2017, with the prosecution and defense interviewing 34 witnesses, including Monique Portillo, the woman that had been with Daniel Shaver just prior to the shooting. The prosecution faced an uphill battle, not only because of the information being omitted from the jury, but because Arizona state has some very unique laws regarding gun rights. Basically, the state would have to disprove that Brailsford was acting in self-defense, having to prove that the killing was intentional, hence the charge of second-degree murder. Susie Charbel, the deputy county attorney of Maricopa County, argued in court. Quote, "The state will show the defendant wasn't acting like a reasonable officer. He was acting like a killer. Brailsford doesn't get a pass because he was wearing a police uniform that night." Meanwhile, Brailsford's defense seemed to rely on the fact that he was a police officer, and as such, was afraid for his and his fellow officers' lives when he fired 5 shots at Daniel Shaver. Brailsford himself took the stand and stated, quote, "I believed 100% that he was reaching for a gun."
Now, at the moment when the decision to fire is made, did you believe that there was an imminent threat of serious injury or death to yourself and others?
Absolutely. I thought he was reaching for a gun, and I thought someone was going to get shot.
Would you have fired your weapon if you did not believe that to be the case?
No, sir.
Did you also, at the moment the decision to shoot was made, as indicated in that frame, believe that you were going to be taking Mr. Shaver into custody and turned over to detectives for the firearms incident at the window?
My hope was that no lethal force was going to be necessary, that Mr. Shaver wouldn't reach behind his back, and that he would be taken into custody, and detectives would pursue the investigation at that point.
Was it your belief at the moment that you made the decision to fire the weapon at Mr. Shaver that it was immediately necessary to protect against his use or attempted use of bringing a weapon out?
Yes, sir. I had a split second, and in that moment when I saw that motion, I had to make a decision right then and there.
No slow motion videos?
No, sir.
And did you have a belief at the time you fired the weapon that your action was necessary to prevent the commission of the potential aggravated assault with a weapon?
It was absolutely necessary in that moment.
And did you, at that moment the decision's made, believe that Mr. Shaver posed an immediate threat of serious injury or death to yourself and others?
I wouldn't have fired my weapon if I didn't think so.
And do you believe that the discharge of your weapon under those totality of circumstances against Mr. Shaver that evening was consistent with your training that you received at the Mesa Police Academy?
I followed my training exactly how I was trained, and I believe that.
By Officer and Training Instructor Jacobs?
Yes.
Now, when you fired your weapon, how many times did you fire?
I fired until I determined that there was no longer a threat.
And how do you determine that?
There's several ways you can determine that, but for me it was when I saw Mr. Shaver fall over, I saw that there was no longer a threat.
It turns out now that we know you fired for about 0.8 of a second.
Yes.
And 5 times.
Yes.
Were they quick shots?
They were extremely fast.
All right. And did you stop firing when you perceived that the threat was over?
Immediately.
What was your feelings at that point?
I was in shock. I couldn't believe that had happened, that I had just been in a shooting. It was scary.
Did you fear for your own safety during this shooting?
I was terrified, and I was scared for everyone else.
Did you overreact?
No, sir.
Did you feel like you overreacted?
No, I did not.
Now later, you know, it was determined that he did not, in fact, have a weapon.
That's correct.
When did you find that out?
The next day, after the investigation, after the interview.
So when the interview occurred, you had not been told that he'd been unarmed?
No.
I guess he hadn't been searched at that point.
No, he hadn't been searched at that point.
When did you find out that he had consumed copious amounts of alcohol?
Quite some time after. It wouldn't have been until after the autopsy report had returned.
Did you have indication in your mind that he was intoxicated that night?
That didn't even cross my mind.
What about the claim now that he was actually reaching for his shorts? Did that go through your mind at those moments?
No, sir.
Were you paying attention to shorts, or?
No.
What were you paying attention to?
My focus was on Mr. Shaver's hands.
And had Mr. Shaver been advised not to put his hands out of sight for any reason seconds before the shooting occurred?
Yes, sir.
And did you hear those instructions?
I did.
Now, there was an exchange between Officer Langley after he did it where Mr. Shaver was warned at least twice not to do this or he'd be shot. And he then followed that up by saying, "Don't shoot me."
Yes.
And then Officer Langley gave the warning again to him, and then for unknown reasons he chose to do what we've seen on the video.
That's correct.
Did you notice, I'm talking about that night, that exchange, or what were you taking away in the moment of that exchange, or if anything?
In the moment, I didn't really perceive the dialogue between the two. My main focus was on Mr. Shaver's actions and his hands.
Did you know that he had been warned what not to do with his hands?
I did know that what he had been warned.
Did you notice that in response to the warning he said, "Don't shoot me"?
Yes.
Do you remember hearing it that night?
I didn't remember hearing it that night, but upon reviewing the video hundreds of times, I've been able, yes, that.
And what about that he was upset and apparently crying in those seconds before the discharge of the weapon? Did that enter your mind that night as you were on lethal coverage in that few seconds?
No, that didn't enter my mind, and we're trained that we're not necessarily to pay attention to what a suspect is saying, and we're supposed to watch their actions and what they do with their hands.
And as they say, actions speak louder than words?
Exactly.
At one point, Brailsford told the jury, quote, "If the situation happened exactly as it did that time, I would have done the same thing." Brailsford's defense seemed to rely upon a couple of prior court cases, including one heard in the U.S. Supreme Court. That case, Graham v. Connor, asked the jurors to put themselves in the shoes of the officer and make a split-second decision to use lethal force. A mistake in either direction could result in someone dying. That case, which went to the Supreme Court in 1989, ruled that police have the defense of life standard, which allows them to shoot a suspect if they believe the suspect poses a dangerous threat to others. In another similar case cited by the defense, Tennessee v. Garner, a cop is allowed to shoot a fleeing suspect if they believe the suspect is trying to flee custody. As you can imagine, this was turning into a rather emotional affair, in which Daniel Shaver's loved ones argued that he was not fleeing custody. He was trying to abide by the police officer's ridiculous demands, which seemed to stretch his physical and mental limits while intoxicated. A rather contentious moment broke out in court when one of Philip Brailsford's attorneys referred to him as Officer Brailsford, and Lainey Sweet, Daniel's widow, yelled out "ex-officer" from the court gallery. This forced an apology from Lainey's attorney, but she would later speak to the press about this outburst. Quote, "I think it's important that he knows that he is a former police officer. When you're an officer, you're entitled to privilege, and he lost that privilege when he murdered my husband." On December 7th, 2017, after 6 weeks of a very contentious trial, the jury gathered in the court to deliver their ruling. The 8-member jury had spent 2 days deliberating, and were now prepared to deliver their verdict.
We, the jury, duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled action, and upon our oaths, do find the defendant, Philip Micheal Brailsford, on the charge of count 1, second-degree murder, not guilty. Signed, foreperson, juror number 3. Is this your true verdict, so say you one and all?
Following the resolution of Philip Brailsford's trial for second-degree murder, his body camera footage was released to the rest of the world, this time unedited. For the first time, the public got to see the video of Daniel Shaver's shooting in its entirety. The entire video was released to the public approximately 3 hours after Philip Brailsford was acquitted, and it showed the several minutes of footage that had been previously omitted. The world at large was now able to see the video of Daniel Shaver crawling on the floor of the Quinta Inn and Suites, intoxicated, begging to not get shot. As you can imagine, the backlash to this newly released video was quite severe, while the public had been mostly stuck between a rock and a hard spot, having to decide between the police and the victim of another senseless shooting. The full unedited video made it an easy choice for most. Thousands of people took to social media, including those from all over the political and social spectrum, and began referring to Daniel Shaver's death as an outright execution. Black Lives Matter activist Sean King referred to the body cam footage of the shooting as one of the worst things he had ever seen. On Facebook, he stated, quote, "After you watch this video, which is horrible, you will wonder how the officer was not found guilty of a crime." Omar Badar, the deputy director of the Arab American Institute, tweeted, "This is one of the most disturbing things I have ever seen. Not for the brutality of the shooting itself, but for the sadism of the cop who is getting off on humiliating a pliant and obedient suspect before ultimately shooting him. Popular podcast host Joe Rogan discussed this incident on his show, referring to the death of Daniel Shaver as quote-unquote murder. He was joined by a chorus of like-minded others, ranging from everyone on the political spectrum from the Young Turks to Ben Shapiro, in criticizing the police overreach. This body cam footage would end up being viewed by millions, as it was shared on social media and highlighted on national news broadcast. It would even spawn some local protest in Mesa, Arizona, just a day or two after Philip Brailsford's acquittal, which were joined by a former Mesa police officer named Scott Safranca.
What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now!
You hear it right there, calling for justice after a man is shot and killed by a Mesa police officer 2 years ago. This was the scene yesterday in downtown Mesa as people gathered to protest the shooting death of Daniel Shaver by former officer Mitch Brailsford. The former officer was just acquitted of second-degree murder. A former officer who was once shot on duty was actually at the rally to show his support.
It's actually a really unique position because I still have people on the force that I care about. I want to make sure that, both sides are covered and that we can move forward and make sure that not only our police officers are safe, but the public is safe as well, and that there's true accountability for any actions that occur.
In March of 2018, just a few months after the acquittal of Philip Brailsford, it was announced that the Department of Justice was opening up its own separate investigation into the shooting death of Daniel Shaver. Sergeant Steve Berry, a spokesman for Mesa Police, told reporters that the US DOJ had subpoenaed their department and had requested all documentation surrounding the Daniel Shaver shooting. He described it as a civil rights investigation, which may entail 4th, 5th, and even 14th Amendment issues. As always, the Department of Justice refused to comment, but many have speculated that they would not have opened this inquiry for no reason. This investigation may take years, and may not even produce any charges against Philip Brailsford, but may end up enacting a heavy toll against the Mesa Police Department for how they handled the incident and their training protocols. In addition, a number of lawsuits have been filed against the city of Mesa, Arizona, and the police agencies involved. Monique Portillo, the only other person in the hallway that evening, filed a lawsuit of her own claiming that her civil rights had been disregarded and alleged police brutality. However, that lawsuit seems to pale in comparison to the one filed by Daniel Shaver's widow, Lainey Sweet, which is still working its way through the court system. The wife of Daniel Shaver is seeking more than $100 million in damages, but has said that she is willing to settle for $75 million, money that will be taken directly from Arizona taxpayers if approved. She says that she is willing to accept a high price for her husband's death, because she wants to send a message to those responsible, that while they may be free from legal ramifications for pulling the trigger, the cost of their reckless behavior will enact a heavy toll on those that employ them. Many continue to hope that the death of Daniel Shaver will help enact some change or reform in our criminal justice system. After all, his story, as tragic as it was, is a familiar one. I could have chosen countless stories of similar incidents from all across America. In particular, similar stories that happen to young black men, but either don't get the widespread response that Daniel Shaver's did for a variety of reasons. In fact, the shooting death of Daniel Shaver wasn't even an isolated incident in the region it happened, Mesa, Arizona. This area seems to be a hotbed of police shootings and allegations of police brutality, Whether it be the excessive beating of a man named Robert Johnson in May of 2018, another incident that was caught on police body cameras, or the 2015 shooting of a mentally ill man named Ivan Kirstic. That incident resulted in a $1 million payout for Kirstic's family members just a few months ago, which again was paid out by Maricopa County taxpayers. In fact, if you simply Google Mesa, Arizona police shooting for any given year, you'll find numerous examples. It seems like every day, there are similar stories breaking out nationwide, where men and women are losing their lives for seemingly no reason. For what it's worth, I acknowledge that police officers have a very tough job. I'm well accustomed to their profession, and one of my close family members is a highly regarded member of law enforcement in Washington state. However, I am also incredibly close with people that have jobs that are every bit as dangerous as police officers. And those people seem to be held to much higher standards, especially when it comes to firearms and firearms safety. So, where do we draw the line? I'm sure you don't want me pontificating for another 5 minutes, but I'm honestly just tired of reading these stories every single day. There are people dying for seemingly no reason, and there are countless loved ones being left without any kind of resolution. And for what exactly? Peace of mind? Miscommunication? If you watch the footage of this incident, which I encourage you do, by the way, you'll see that Daniel Shaver was not a threat to anyone. He was given conflicting demands, all of which would have been impossible to follow, except perhaps by the incredibly deft and sure-footed. Most that have reviewed this footage have agreed that the officers that handled this incident responded incredibly irrationally, and, as local officials agree, were not qualified to be doing their jobs. They constantly yelled at Daniel before he could answer or respond to any of their questions, and they continued to give him conflicting demands. Keep his arms behind his back, but to crawl towards them. Keep his hands in the air and his legs crossed, but to crawl towards them. All the while constantly reminding him that any mistake would result in him being shot and killed. Is that the kind of behavior you expect from law enforcement officers? The ones meant to keep the peace and protect us all from evil. And for those of you with pro-gun tendencies, just think about this. Arizona is an open carry state. Police were called to the scene because they suspected Daniel had been aiming a gun out of a window, which we all agree is a problem. However, if he had a gun on his person, which he did not, he technically would have been 100% in the right, legally speaking. Simply put, it seems like there was nothing Daniel Shaver could have done to change the end of his story, as sad as that is. He was intoxicated in his hotel room, harming no one, and exited his hotel room with his arms up. He tried to comply with the demands being made of him over the span of 5 minutes, and he was shot 5 times for the simple mistake of trying to pull up his pants. To date, the only real ramification from the death of Daniel Shaver is that the man who pulled the trigger, Philip Brailsford, lost his job. He was charged and acquitted of any wrongdoing by a jury of his peers, and I honestly respect that decision. This was a messy situation, and I personally don't blame him for what happened to Daniel Shaver. Others might, but I think this entire ordeal is just a symptom of a much larger problem. Police that are held to much lower standards than our own military operating overseas in active war zones. Police who operate under a shoot first and ask questions later mentality. I can only hope that we hear more from Daniel's loved ones in the near future, because I still consider his story very much unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. I know that this episode might not have been what you were expecting from Unresolved, as I usually try to avoid touchy subjects, such as any real political or social issues. And I know that this episode might upset some of you, but honestly, I hope it does. Most of the stories I cover are true crime based, and true crime is not a safe subject. It's a genre of storytelling that intersects directly with the darkest aspects of real life. And that's what this story does. It's made me equal parts sad and pissed off just reading about it. And if you feel that same way, good. Get pissed off. Just don't tell me. Let your representatives in Congress know that we need criminal justice reform from the top down, so that I no longer have to read about stories like this. I would honestly love that. Trust me, if I could spend each episode telling stories like the Max Headroom incident or Lake City Quiet Pills, I would probably be a much happier person in real life. But I also think it's important to keep stories like this alive, so here we are. If any of you would like to stay in touch with the podcast, make sure to look us up on social media. Just search for Unresolved or Unresolved Pod, and our accounts should show up for you. You can send in any emails to michael@unresolved.me. That's micheal@unresolved.me. And you can send in any voicemails or text to 831-200-3550. That's 831-200-3550. If you want to find a transcript of this episode, or any applicable links or sources, just head to the podcast website, which is unresolved.me. There you could also find a link to the podcast store at the top of the page, as well as a link to our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/unresolvedpod. I have something pretty different planned for the next couple of weeks, a re-examination of stories I have previously covered, so make sure to stay tuned for that. Until then, everyone, stay safe, and I will talk to you later.